Welcome to episode 32 of the On the Air podcast. We've been rolling along with these all summer long, and it's great to finish things out this summer with a hockey voice. We'll cool things down a little bit. Dan Duva, the voice of the Las Vegas Golden Knights. And Dan, you might be the first to be doing it outside. I think definitely the second coolest after Vince Cotroneo from the A's did it from the actual ballpark, but definitely the second coolest background we've had so far.
The mean streets of Asbury Park, New Jersey. This is where it's all at. Springsteen country, as I like to say. And down the shore, everything's all right, Aiden. But you know that. You're a Northeast guy.
So how does this work? You're in Vegas during the season, and then you're kind of back at home in New Jersey in the off season, or is this just a quick vacation?
This is more of a pit stop in New Jersey. I end up spending a good chunk of the summer in Cape Cod in Massachusetts, helping out some of the student broadcasters in the Cape Cod Baseball League with the Chatham A's. So where I am on a given day depends on where it is. There's a team I'm working with. So if the Vegas Golden Knights are in Vegas, that's where I am. We're on the road. That's where I'll be. And sometimes elsewhere. But I did go back to Vegas for about a week for the NHL draft. We did some coverage of the draft live from Las Vegas. And I'll be back here on the East Coast for a few more weeks. And then training camp will kick up in September and then back on the road.
How have the past few months been like from your perspective, getting to call the games remotely? I know your team, the Vegas Golden Knights, were in first place when the season came to a halt, and then you resume things, and now you jump into this new season, and now you're going to have another season coming up. What has it all been like from your perspective?
It was no fun in March of 2020 when everything stopped. At first, they said just a week, maybe two, and that turned into a month, maybe two. And then we were told, yeah, they're going to be playing in Edmonton, Alberta, and broadcasters are not going. That was not ideal. Not what we had in mind, but we did broadcast the games remotely. We had a terrific support from the Golden Knights and from our broadcast entities, radio and AT&T Sportsnet on television that allowed us to do a lot of what we would have liked to do had we been in person. Nothing will ever compare to being in and being seen. And I do think that we missed a great deal of the story because we could not be in person. But we did the best that we could for those 2 months of the 2020 Stanley Cup playoffs. And when the 2021 season started in January, we began doing the home games in person, but the road games from the same studio. But after about a month, we began traveling again. And the first big trip was to Lake Tahoe for the game on the golf course. That was a lot of fun to be broadcasting ringside with no fans. Just the people who had to be there. And I was glad that the radio broadcast was included in that. And then it was a matter of which places were we allowed to travel. And most places were a green light. Only one or two were a little bit delayed in letting us in. So going to Minnesota for the first round of the playoffs, Colorado the second round, and even Montreal in the third round was terrific. It was much better than doing the studio broadcast for the Stanley Cup playoffs. Montreal was a bit different because of the conditions there. We had to stay either in the hotel or in the arena, couldn't even go out to dinner. Whereas in Minnesota, going out to dinner and being around, going to Tom Reed's bar. Tom Reed, the longtime North Stars player and broadcaster with the Wild. And then in Denver, a bunch of us went to a Colorado Rockies game. So Montreal was a little bit of a step back in time, but we're looking forward to being back in arenas and being around fans, being around other teams' broadcasters and writers, and hopefully going into locker rooms and getting to talk to players and coaches like we always have.
Is that something that you've enjoyed more about getting to go back onto the road, getting to travel and meet with old friends and kind of move around in the cities?
No doubt. When we went to St. Louis, I think it was early March, it had been the first time that visiting broadcasters went to St. Louis. So the things that we had left in place the previous year, it turned out by coincidence, we had been the last visiting team in St. Louis the year before. And some of the same upgrades they had been working on a year earlier in the booth had not finished. They had not been touched in a year. So that was strange. But the engineer there, Jim Jackson, did a great job getting us all set up and on the air. And then talking with the broadcasters, whether it's, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kerber, the whole crew there. It's fantastic to be around writers. And I'll tell you this one, Aiden, when we were broadcasting that particular game in St. Louis, it was a little bit of a lopsided game. Golden Knights winning by, I think, 5-1 in the final minutes. And when there's that kind of a game, you're looking for other stuff to describe. And it turned out we had come across some Golden Knights fans who had gone on this trip to St. Louis. And it's the group who throw the victory flamingo on the ice after a Golden Knights victory at T-Mobile Arena. And here they had made it to St. Louis. We spotted them in the crowd. My broadcast partner, Gary Lawless, had talked to them a day or two earlier. So we were tracking the flamingo people as they made their way from their seats down toward the ice, pounded mitts with the usher, and they sort of gave them the green light after Vegas won to fling the flamingo onto the ice. And it became sort of a play-by-play within the play-by-play of the flamingo folks and the flamingo going onto the ice. And that's something that never would have happened had we been calling the game off of the monitor, to say nothing of going to morning skate and seeing who was on which line and getting to watch all of that sort of stuff. It was such a big hit that we even had a zoologist tweeting at us about whether a flamingo is a flightless bird or not. And by the way, flamingos can fly. I love that anecdote because it illustrates something that we never would have known we would have missed. That's the big part about broadcasting remotely. Sure, we are adapting and we do what we can from a remote setting, but it's sort of like the Bob Woodward quote about journalism. Central dilemma of journalism is that you don't know what you don't know. And when you're broadcasting remotely, you don't know what you're missing, and you never will. And I think that's an example of something I'm sure our TV guys, Dave Gosher and Shane Knighty, because they were not in the building, ever would have noticed. But because we were there, because we had that conversation, because we saw the Flamingo folks in person, we had a whole great story that would not have been there otherwise.
So one of my favorite guests, Kevin Brown, has talked about this a little bit, and you mentioned the flamingo. How important is it to be well-rounded like that and be able to talk about things outside of the game at hand?
Well, you're right to say that Kevin Brown is among your favorite guests because he's one of the favorite broadcasters of mine. Full disclosure, he's a friend of mine too. And if he's done a show, I would be listening to it. Kevin's point is right on. I think that while we happen to have chosen sports play-by-play as our career focus, there's so much more to being a well-rounded person than just sports or sports broadcasting, or even just broadcasting, even journalism. There's so much of just being a person that you bring into your broadcast. We hear more and more about personality, and that is something that people, I suppose, cultivate now. I don't think it's about having a brand as a broadcaster. It's about developing who you are. It happens that we're in broadcasting, and you bring that to your broadcast every day because we like to entertain people. And I think that's why people tune into a broadcast. They're hoping to, first of all, find out who's winning and who's losing. Is their team, doing what you hope they would? But people also want to be entertained. People want to be informed. As journalists, we're documenting what's happening. There's a historical component to that. We sort of have a first draft of history as live play-by-play broadcasters. But I think that when you think of the balance of those things, entertainment and information, I think of Mike Wallace, the great 60 Minutes journalist, who talked about the balance of heat and light. Heat being the drama and the light being in the information. If you have too much of one and not enough of the other, it just doesn't work. Too much drama for drama's sake really is more of a show. It's sensational. That's not what we're after. And if it's too much light, too much information, and not enough drama, well, then that's just boring. And boring is rude. So finding the right balance is what we're after. And I think if we're not well-rounded, as you say, then you're not bringing the whole picture into focus. You might see something right in front of you that's pertaining to the game, but you might not be able to draw in some additional context to help the listener, to help the viewer really understand what's going on. So whether it's, I'll tell you this, Aiden, I enjoy reading a lot, but I don't read a ton of sports books. But I think that all of the things I read about help me be a better sports broadcaster.
Do you have a favorite anecdote or story that you've ever used outside of sports?
Oh, I think of, as I speak to you from Asbury Park, New Jersey, I've been known to slip in some Springsteen lyrics into broadcasts from time to time. And maybe a few people notice it. Most of the time people miss it. I think that, speaking of Kevin Brown, I remember sitting in the Syracuse Chiefs press box, on many occasions, but a couple of times come to mind in particular where, mixed in a Springsteen lyric into a blowout Syracuse Chiefs baseball game might have been amusing to us at the time, but it was just one of those stretches. The Chiefs weren't doing well. So I had a notebook out, and it was Kevin Brown and Eric Galante doing the Chiefs at the time. I think it was the first year that Jason Benetti was not there. He'd moved up to ESPN and then the White Sox. But I was sitting there. I wasn't broadcasting the game. I was just sitting in the booth with those two guys. And I just kept scribbling down whether Springsteen lyrics or random characters, random words that they might try to mix into the broadcast. And it became a little bit of a challenge for those two guys who could get in more. And I'm talking everything from matzah to Angela Lansbury, like you name it. I was coming up with the most random stuff to get in for these guys to put on the broadcast. And if you didn't know who Angela Lansbury was, you might not be able to make a reference to Murder, She Wrote. Just that sort of stuff. You can never project or anticipate exactly how your well-roundedness will fit into a broadcast. It's simply understanding that you have a lot to draw from. There's an analogy I really like about the ballast of your preparation. There are all kinds of numbers, breakdowns. 10% of your preparation you get on the air, 1/8 of your preparation you get on the air. The trouble is you don't know which 10% or which 1/8. So if you think about it like an iceberg, 7/8 of an iceberg are underwater. Only 1/8 can you see from above the water. And that portion of the iceberg you can't see is what gives the portion of the iceberg you can see its strength, its ballast, its foundation. So I think that you never really do know what it is will come into a broadcast. I'm straining to think of any other specific moments. I'll stick, Aiden, with my random references to Angela Lansbury that I set up for Kevin Brown and Eric Galante that one time. That was fun, even though I was not even on the air. I was facilitating it for them.
Am I right that you have a whole binder full of, or multiple binders full of those little notes of notebooks just that you've taken on different broadcasters?
Well, I mean, that's true. I have kept a lot of notes over the years, and some of it's more digital now, but I that's a different notebook than the notebook I may have had in the press box for that particular Syracuse Chiefs game. I was just scribbling things down on any paper that was handy. So the binder you're thinking of, I've kept for a long time, and it didn't start out as a loose collection of papers and note cards, and I just at some point had the good sense of organizing some of it, and a binder seemed to be the best place to do that, sort of a scrapbook. And that binder contains everything from notes that I had taken about my own broadcast, listening to a tape and writing down things I wanted to improve upon. Other people, whether it be peers or professionals, listening to my broadcast, offering some feedback. Sometimes it's what I have thought of other broadcasters. Pull up a Major League Baseball game or NBA game and write down what you hear as you're watching it. Sometimes it's going back to an old tape, a broadcast from the 60s, and how did they call basketball then? Writing down some stuff about that, comparing and contrasting broadcasters, articles about broadcasters. Somebody has written something about Vince Scully. I print that out, put it in the binder. So it's a collection of stuff that I will occasionally refer back to. I love when sports announcers came to visit us as students, would talk about the business. You could ask a bunch of questions, and many had thoughts that had not occurred to me. And rather than sitting in a classroom, just sort of nodding my head along or treating it like it might be just a show on Netflix, what a great opportunity. I want to remember this. So I would write stuff down, whether it was, Gary Cohen talking about the rocking chair pace to baseball, something he had picked up from Bob Murphy, or Ian Eagle, who had been so good to me when I was a teenager. What you put into an experience is what makes it worthwhile. And I have a few things that stick in my brain and come out as quickly as those two just did, because I've repeated them to a lot of other people. But I can flip through that binder, Aiden, and find stuff that even today will help me zero in my focus, become a sharper broadcaster. There's so many lessons in all of this. We're always trying to get better. And the day you think that you're good and you can't get any better is the day you should hang them up. I've always felt that it's a constant approach of growth. So the binder is there. I'll flip through it occasionally. The original one is filled to the gills. I can't stuff anything more into the original one. And now I like to keep notebooks to add on to the original binder.
I think it was my cousins that told me a story about how he just sat down one Sunday night and wrote down every word that Dan Schulman said on Sunday Night Baseball. What do you learn from an experience like that, where you're going through and really listening to the pros of the industry?
Yeah, I've got a piece of paper in that binder that is Marv Albert calling a basketball game. Is probably, I don't know, 15 years ago. And on the same piece of paper, there's like a coffee stain. There's like a short grocery shopping list. And then on the bottom, there's just Marv Albert. And it's just a phrase here, like in the pivot, or just not even a word, but just a turn of phrase. And you think, okay, well, I know what he's saying. I don't quite use it that way, but maybe in the right moment, I can use that. And it might be an inspiration for something else. I remember using the term a window bucket for a basketball play. And Mike Breen listened to that tape and he said, window bucket, where did you get that? I said, I don't know. It just came to me. And Mike seemed to like it. I don't know if he borrowed it or not, but I don't know that I had borrowed it from something else, but it probably came to me because I was examining the language of other broadcasters. So it might not have been a direct transposing of one announcer's own repertoire. I don't really think about it that way. It's more about what you might discover for yourself. And just the act of writing things down helps stimulate your brain in a way that a lot of other activities might not. Again, you can watch a game on TV, listen to a game on the radio, and I'm pretty critical when I'm watching or when I'm listening. But if I've not written something down, it might not stick with me, it might not resonate with me. It's more likely to initiate some sort of a thought process if I've written something down. So I think that's the big benefit of it. We all hear broadcasters whenever we turn on an event, but how often are we writing things down as we do so? I think that sort of sparks some additional level of thinking, at least for me.
Do you have specific, a couple, 2 or 3 specific favorites that you like to use on the air for descriptive words?
No, I don't. I wouldn't say that. It's very much about what do you see and how can you best present it. One, I'm not sure, I wouldn't call it my favorite, Aiden, but I think there's something to in hockey that I haven't heard too many announcers do on radio. And if you are dumping the puck into one particular end of the ice, oftentimes that puck goes around the boards. And the boards, because they are rounded after all in the corners, the puck goes in a somewhat circular path. And people might say it goes around the boards. But on the radio, which direction is around the boards? And you might say left to right, but that could be confusing because maybe the player is skating from left to right. So one of the things that I began doing, and I couldn't tell you when, but I began to describe that puck around the boards as either going clockwise or counterclockwise. And I think that without too much effort helps the listener understand and visualize that the puck is dumped in counterclockwise and it's going around the boards behind the goal and around to the far side of the ice, or then in the other way, if it goes clockwise on the near boards and around to the other side of the ice. So that's something I don't know that I would call it my favorite, but that's something that occurred to me at some point, probably in the minors, and I've continued doing from time to time. It's sort of like Mike Emmerich would use the roulette wheel to describe the puck around the boards, which is nice. You can do that on television. You can see which way the puck is going, but on the radio, I'm not as much of a gambler as you might think for someone in Las Vegas. So I don't even know which direction a roulette wheel goes, which way the ball bounces, if it's clockwise or counterclockwise. So I use that description. That's just a little something that I don't know that too many announcers do.
So full disclosure, I'm not a hockey guy. I've done maybe 5-6 games over the last 4 years as a high school hockey announcer. I never really figured out why hockey is so different from every other sport, in that the TV and radio broadcasts, I feel like, are almost indistinguishable. Would you kind of agree with that, in that it's every other sport? You could pretty much figure out within 2-3 seconds of listening to a guy whether he's calling it for a radio or TV, but I feel like you can't really do that with hockey.
The big thing missing from television play-by-plays compared to radio would be left and right. I might not need to say that the player has the puck on the left wing. You might just say the wing. You might not need to say that it's in the left wing corner on TV, but on radio you would. So it's there are little things you might leave out. Radio is about description. Television is about captioning. And I would enjoy in Syracuse with the Crunch, the American Hockey League team, we'd do about a dozen regular season games on television and then all home playoff games on television. So to switch from radio to television on sometimes on a basis is an eye-opener for me, and just it meant to do hockey on radio versus hockey on television, and really how much more taxing it is on radio. There are so many additional things you want to illustrate, whereas on television, it's about identifying who's on the ice, and by the inflection, you can bring attention toward a particular moment. If you can rise to the occasion and punch that big moment on TV. Radio, there's still more of a rhythm. I know what you mean, and I think you're right with regard to how a lot of announcers on TV call hockey, not too different sounding than radio. I think that's more because a lot of hockey announcers do hockey and only hockey, and perhaps there hasn't been as much of an evolution in distinguishing one from the other. Announcers who are doing multiple sports, for instance, Kenny Albert is among the very best in any sport, but he does it all: football, baseball, hockey, and basketball. And if you hear Kenny do a game on the radio for the Rangers, I think that, at least in my ear, you can hear something different for his New York Rangers broadcast compared to his NBC, or now what will be Turner broadcast nationally. So there are some little things. It is the closest sounding, I agree with that, between hockey compared to the other major sports. But I have had in my experience the nuances that are different have to do with scaling back that description. Another element, Aiden, I think has to do with the advent of HDTV. When you had the square televisions, the old standard def, you really couldn't see the puck very well. And if you watch even old clips on YouTube, it's hard to follow exactly where the puck is because the video quality is not just grainier, it's also more narrow. With a widescreen aspect, 16 by 9, plus HDTV, whether you got your 1080p or now your 4K, you can see the puck, but you can also see where the puck is going because of the wider view. And I think that at an earlier age of broadcasting, announcers didn't really want to scale back too much description because you couldn't see very much on TV. You could kind of see where the players were, but it was hard. The puck was a failed experiment in the mid-90s to try to counteract that difficulty, but HDTV came along, and now I believe that hockey on television does not need near the description that it once did.
What is it like calling a game rinkside? I've never had that experience. I'm sure, especially with Lake Tahoe, I know they had the glare problem. They had to move some games around. How did you go about calling that from a very different vantage point than you would normally have?
Before the game, Mike Tirico, who was broadcasting for NBC, had come over. We were chatting. He said, "All right, Danny, when the play is down at your end, you text me, and when it's down at our end, I'll text you." And that, of course, was not actually going to suffice. But the recognition was the challenge of being so close. And we were on the penalty bench side of the ice, which is preferable compared to the bench side. So at least we could see when the teams were changing players, who was going off, who was coming on. It felt like broadcasting a high school game. I grew up in North Jersey, and broadcasting for the Ridgewood Maroons, Bergen County. We played a lot of teams with rinks without any sort of significant seating area. And so when you're broadcasting at ice level, you realize what you can't see. And I think of one rink in Old Bridge, New Jersey, where we were on the bench side of the ice. There was no elevation. We weren't only at ice level, we were down near a corner, but not all the way into the corner. So you really couldn't see anything that had happened on the other end of the ice along the near boards. And boy, that was less than ideal. And it felt a little bit like that for the game at Lake Tahoe, especially for the first period, because the monitors we had were near impossible to see. The sun not only was causing problems on the ice, but causing problems for our visual acuity. But when the sun went down and we had our 8-hour intermission before the second period. It was 9 o'clock local time when they started once again. Then you could see the monitors. So when the play was down at the other end of the ice, you could pick up what was happening. You find your ways to pause, and you'd want to avoid saying something incorrect. If, for example, I thought that the players on the ice were Marchessault, Carlson, and Smith, I might assume that it's Riley Smith on the right wing going to get the puck in the right wing corner. But I didn't want to assume that. And I had to get over the instinct in my brain to just sort of assume it was him because I could see him. That's probably him. Therefore, I'm going to say it. I didn't have enough evidence, right? You're talking about primary source, secondary source. I did not have enough sources. I didn't have not enough things available to me to confirm to the listener that, in fact, it was Riley Smith. So you had to pause a little bit. That was a little bit of a challenge, but not something that was totally unfamiliar. I found that same thing when doing hockey games off of the monitor the previous summer when the team was in the bubble. You weren't sure about stuff. So rather than just blurting it out and hoping you were right, you'd wait a beat, you'd look for some sort of corroborating evidence, and then say, yes, that is Riley Smith in the right wing corner. And you go, hopefully, with your gut instinct. Occasionally, your gut instinct would be wrong, and it's not Riley Smith. He was, he got stuck on the bench and somebody else is on the right wing. So I think it was having that prudence, that patience to see what was there, but not bank on it because I did not have enough corroborating support. I had to be sure I was right. And as a hockey announcer, there's a misconception that announcers must speak very quickly to keep up with the play. That's incorrect, at least in my opinion. It's much more about editing yourself and stripping out what's unnecessary. Eliminate the fluff. So you're not speaking more quickly because it's a fast-paced sport. You're simply thinking more quickly about what to strip away, what's most important right now. So it wasn't too much of a jump to throw in a pause instead of an extra word. That was an adjustment that I anticipated I would have to make, and I'm glad I thought ahead when it came to that approach.
It's interesting you brought up editing yourself because that's something I've kind of learned a little bit about over the past summer, having done more baseball on the radio than I've ever really done in my life. Most of it was TV up until this past summer. Do you feel like you are a little bit more lenient with being able to wait a second or two to make sure that a play happens? And I guess this would not be so much with hockey, but maybe with football or baseball, when you're on when you're on TV, obviously you have to kind of keep up with the play. They can see what's going on. But do you feel like when you're on the radio, you can give it a second just to see how the play plays out because nobody can see and it doesn't really matter if you're right up with the play or not?
I always try to be on time because while a listener might not see what I see in real time, chances are the people in attendance do and react audibly. Therefore, the listener can hear the reaction of those in attendance. So if you hear the crowd react, or if, for example, in baseball, you hear the crack of the bat, and then I say, here's the pitch, no. The listener knows that the pitch not only has been thrown already, but that the batter has swung and made contact. So if I say, if you hear the crack of the bat and then you say, here's the pitch, I'm behind. And the listener all of a sudden feels like I'm in some sort of delay or time warp where what the announcer is saying is not keeping up with what's happening in a moment. And like I said, with regard to hockey, it's about stripping away what's unnecessary. There are, whether it's hockey or the other sports, but in particular hockey, 100 things are going on in any given moment. And I might be able to observe well a dozen of them. I only have time to maybe talk about one or two. Experience with the sport of hockey allows me to anticipate what may happen next so I can better connect the dots. So out of those 100 things happening, I see 12 of them. The two that I want to talk about, I decide between those two based on what may happen next. And that's perhaps an oversimplification of it, but that's how I anticipate what's going on. Not that I'm predicting what's going on, but it's an experience with the sport. So you might have a sense of what's likely to happen next. If a defender has the puck in his zone, the next thing to happen is probably not a goal for that team in its own zone. There are some other things. Where's the breakout? Is there going to be a line change? Is there going to be a forecheck from the offensive team, et cetera, et cetera? And I think it all goes back to that sense that you want a fan to have of being at the event. I want somebody after a game is over to talk about a game as if he or she sat right next to me and experienced it in person. And if you're there watching what's happening and you don't really have an indication that what the announcer is saying lines up with what's happening, you'll have a distorted understanding of what's going on. I want somebody to feel like they're right at the game with me, and perhaps they've turned their glance away from the ice for a moment. So with all of those sports, whether it's football and you drop back for a pass, I want to know when the center has snapped the ball. In basketball, when and again, specifically on the radio, when someone is set to take a free throw, I want the drama. I want the buildup. He's ready at the line. He looks over the basket. Here's the free throw. Then there's a brief pause, and then the payoff. Went through. I really think that buildup of suspense and then the release, that the pitch is on the outside corner, strike three, or the pass is caught down to the 20-yard line, or that the free throw is good, right? That buildup, that hesitation, and then the release, the payoff, I think that helps really build the drama in a broadcast, because it's the same thing that you'd feel if you were in the building. I mentioned Bob Murphy earlier, the great Hall of Fame announcer for the New York Mets, and he would, on radio, talk about a high fly ball pretty deep to left center field from Mike Piazza. It may go. Let's watch. Gone, a home run. Well, of course, we can't see it, but he brought the listener along for the ride. And the way that he did it, I could see it right along with Bob. That's just the way he called the game. He didn't do that all the time, but he would bring you right along with him. And that's what I try to do with the broadcast. I want to bring you along with me. And if I'm on time with the play, if I can anticipate, if I can build that suspense and then deliver the payoff, then I think that the listener feels like he or she is really there.
Last three questions that I ask everybody, and then we'll get you out of here. Who is a broadcaster that you've always wanted to meet, dead or alive?
Marty Glickman, the legendary announcer who, of course, was the voice of the Knicks, the New York Football Giants, invented the word swish, and a broadcast mentor to so many, from Marv Albert on down. And Mike Emmerich would tell me about how we'd have lunch with Marty Glickman, and Marty was, and I never did meet Marty, but knew a lot of people who did, and people who were not necessarily people who he knew at Syracuse. I think of Dave Sims, a great broadcaster, Seattle Mariners, ESPN, et cetera. And Dave Sims, I think, would call himself a Marty Glickman disciple. A lot of people who might not have gone through Marty's channels still found ways of connecting with him, and he connected with them, from what I understand. I was a broadcast coach at NBC, was a broadcast coach at Fordham University, and influenced a lot of young announcers, but veteran announcers too. And his book, his autobiography, I'd highly recommend. It came out in the mid-90s, shortly after he retired from broadcasting. His last gig was with the New York Jets on radio in the early 90s. But the book is called The Fastest Kid on the Block, and his life from growing up in Brooklyn through his time as a student at Syracuse University, a track athlete, a football athlete, part of the 1936 U.S. Olympic team in Berlin. That story in itself is incredible. There is a documentary made about Marty. It's called Glickman. Producer Jim Friedman did a fantastic job, and a lot of notable people, including broadcasters, talking about Marty Glickman, from Marv Albert to Mike Breen and on. But so many people who Marty Glickman has touched. And I would love to meet Marty, to hear some of his stories, a lot of which I've heard, but I'd love to hear them from him. But I'd love to give Marty a little piece of my play-by-play and hear how he might offer some critical feedback. That would be great. Sadly, it won't happen, but I think a lot of his mantra, consider the listener, will pervade sports broadcasting for decades and perhaps centuries to come.
Favorite stadium or arena you've gotten to call a game from?
I would say Veterans Field, home of the Chatham A's and the Cape Cod Baseball League. I don't think too many people would have expected that one, because T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas is fantastic. There's not a hockey or an arena experience I've had quite like it. Madison Square Garden is special. I almost said the Forum, but Bell Center in Montreal is really special, even though there were just 3,500 people for that third round series for the Golden Knights and the Canadiens. boy, to be in that building for conference clinching overtime win, that was really neat. So those are the hockey buildings that come to mind. Nashville is really cool too. I will always have a spot in my heart for the Meadowlands, which no longer has hockey or basketball or anything, but the Devils won a few Stanley Cups. And I remember going to a lot of Devils games as a kid and never broadcast a game there myself, though my high school hockey team was one win away from getting to a state championship, lost in the semifinals my freshman year of high school, and I was broadcasting those games. And I come back to Veterans Field in Chatham because it was sort of a proving ground for me, just as it is for so many college baseball players. And when I was 20 years old in 2005, the Chatham A's that season had 6 first-round draft picks, or soon-to-be first-round draft picks. They hadn't been drafted yet, from Evan Longoria to Andrew Miller to Chris Coughlin to Todd Frazier, and just an incredible team. And I remember thinking at that time, one day, and I believe I was quoted in a newspaper saying something to the effect of, one day it'll be great to do this professionally, but right now I enjoy being here with this team and with these players. And it's rare that you get to experience something and know how special it is while you're living through it. That's how special the Chatham experience was for me. And when I'm there in the summer and working with student broadcasters, I'll occasionally allow myself to sit in that particular spot in the press box where I would call games from. It's not my chair any longer, but once in a while, just to be in that spot and look out at Veterans Field where Thurman Munson played in 1967, where Jeff Bagwell played in 87 and 88, Mike Lowell in 94, right on through the guys I just mentioned. To be there and to be part of that, and always to go back, and there's no admission, it's wooden bats. It's just the most pure level of baseball at its highest form. The top college players in America for patrons who don't pay. And that's the special place for me. And I'll always go back to Veterans Field in Chatham, which will turn 100 years old in 2023.
Last question that I ask everybody: what advice do you have to young kids, anybody who wants to get into the industry?
Marinate your head is the phrase used by David McCullough, the great writer of American history. And when David is working, not so much on a book, he says working in a book. And David McCullough wrote a great biography that won the Pulitzer Prize about John Adams. And when he was working on that book, he not only went to, say, the Massachusetts Historical Society to pick up documents that John Adams had went to Independence Hall in Philadelphia and climbed stairs, to see where Adams had been. That sort of immersion is broadcasters, I hope, take charge of, not to wait to come to. And this is college. Arizona State Sun Devils are lucky to have you next year, by the way. That's fantastic to be admitted to a particular school, but what is it that you do there that will really put you in the best position to excel? You can't wait for it to come to you. Your education is not a commodity that is something to be purchased and then you just get a diploma as a result. How do you take advantage of the opportunity? And then when you are covering a team, immersing yourself in the environment, being around the players, or if you're covering a baseball team, not just sitting in the press box, but going into the dugout, going into the clubhouse, going around the batting cage, spending time in the bullpen, going into the manager's office. You've got to surround yourself. Again, marinate your head in everything it means to be part of that team and around that team, because you have access the reader, the listener, the viewer does not. If you're looking up an article online or you're just checking statistics, nowadays, anybody can do that. You can pull out the phone in your pocket, read a story, find a statistic. That's all fine. And there are places for those things within your broadcast. But you have something that the average listener and viewer does not have, and that's intimate access to the participants. Can you get an athlete to tell you something or a coach to tell you something that they've not told to anybody else? That's what I expect from a broadcast, especially for one that is of the team as opposed to a regional or national broadcast. So in all aspects of what you do, Aiden, it's marinate your head in your college experience, your education, broadcasting as an art form, and the teams you're covering, the sport that you're covering. Marinate your head.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your summer. Best of luck once everyone starts hitting the ice again in Vegas.
Well, Aiden, appreciate it, and expect to see you out in the desert before long. Vegas and Tempe are not that far away.
Absolutely.